Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest this week is one of our best known and most successful historians, Dominic Sandbrook, who you might know from his numerous appearances on television where he presents documentaries, is the author of numerous history books. Perhaps best known is his huge history of Britain in the post-war period, which covers politics, economics and culture. The most recent one, which came out, it's now in paperback, is Who Dares Wins, which covers the period from 1979 to 1982, ends with the Falklands Wars. He also writes for the Sunday Times and for the Daily Mail. Thank you very much for joining us, Dominic.
It's a pleasure, thank you. I'm feeling very underdressed now I see how dapper you are.
They all say that. Dominic, I want to talk a bit about your books, but first of all, you wrote a very interesting piece recently about the decline of Labour.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, this will be going out later on this week. There is the Hartlepool by-election. And do you think this is a significant moment, or could be, for Labour?
I think so, because I think you would expect, the government is more than a year into its term. It's been managing a pandemic. You would expect this to be a seat that Labour should win. I mean, it's their own seat, basically. They used to have very healthy majorities in Hartlepool. It's the sort of classic Northern Heartland seat that Labour always used to rely on. And if they don't win it, or if they indeed, I think they probably will win it, but I think they'll win it only very, very narrowly if they do. And, that's an ominous result, I think, for Labour, because all this stuff about the sort of red wall seats, which you all know, Peter, and about the sort of inroads of the Brexit Party, and before that UKIP made into Labour's vote, and that now Boris Johnson has made, there's always this assumption, the talk is always how will Labour win it back? And there's always this sort of assumption that at some point they will win it back, that these voters can be reconverted. And the danger for Labour, and I think you might see this in Hartlepool, is that actually the 2019 election was not an anomaly, but was the beginning of something. The analogy I would give would be when the Republican Party started winning the South in America, which had always previously been Democratic. And basically people, it never went back. And the danger for Labour, I think, is that they end up trapped between two. They've always had this tension, I think, Peter, between the sort of middle class idealists and often quite small c conservative working class voters. And I think that tension is becoming increasingly unmanageable as voters tend to make up their minds on issues of identity and culture and so on. And obviously Brexit was a huge part of that. And I think for Starmer, if he doesn't, win comfortably in Hartlepool, that looks pretty ominous for the 2024 election.
In your books, obviously, you've charted the post-war political scene, and I mean, if you like, the genesis of these problems was quite a long time ago, wasn't it, for Labour, really?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, I've been writing about Britain since the 50s, really, and even as early as about 1968. Actually, let's take 1968. So in 1968, Enoch Powell made his famous, the speech that we remember as the Rivers of Blood speech. And in his diaries at the time, the Labour Cabinet Minister, Richard Crossman, said, this is really a problem for us because a lot of our voters agree with him. And even at that point, so, very early on, there was this sense of an emerging tension between the kind of people who basically ran the Labour Party and the kind of people that they expected to turn out every 5 years to vote for it. And I think that has, it's been getting worse over time. And the other problem, of course, for Labour is it's a Victorian political party that's rooted, its very name, the Labour Party is kind of rooted in this world that basically is gone. You'll know as well as I do that that sort of world of, everybody lived in back-to-backs. They worked in their local factory. They went to their local football club on a Saturday. There was a pub at one end of the street and a kind of Methodist chapel at the other. That world has gone. And Labour has struggled, I think, to adjust to a world in which people see themselves much more as individual consumers than a sort of class-bound in the way that they were in the 1930s or something.
What do you think the chances are, Dominic, of Labour sort of even giving up the pretense of being a working class party for the reasons you said and becoming a radical middle class party?
Well, that might seem an obvious way to go. So you look at the Greens in Germany. Yeah. Labour could try to evolve into a party like that, or a party like the Democrats in the United States. The problem, though, is that, they are the second party in the first past the post system. So that would mean giving up on an awful lot of seats. I mean, hundreds of seats, basically. And, what sane leader of the opposition writes off, 150, yes. Otherwise, hopefully reliable seats and gambles that they can win lots of, leafy, suburban, southern English seats. I think that would be incredibly reckless. I mean, the danger is that you would just win neither. Yes. So I think in a way the electoral system the danger for Labour actually is the electoral system will trap them as a zombie party. They'll always finish second. They'll never, even in 2019 under Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, they won a lot of seats. Not enough, but they still won, more than 200 seats. So that's right, isn't it? They won about 200 seats. I can't remember exactly how many.
202, I think, yes.
Yeah. So the danger is, if you assume that's roughly the floor, and that the ceiling could be, 280 or something, that they just end up permanently trapped around that, and that perhaps over time they are eroded by the Tories. And that they turn into a sort of, could they make it as a kind of superior version of the Lib Dems? I don't know. I think the danger they have now is, of course, the Tories are slightly stealing their clothes. Yes. If you want a party that's levelling up, to use Boris's jargon, and to, doling out the cash and all that sort of stuff, why would you choose Labour when you've got one in government as it is?
Yes. You mentioned there about that way of life going, working class back-to-back, pub on the corner. And, of course, football played a big part in that, has played a big part. And you wrote I don't mean to be, I'm about to be ingratiating, but you...
Oh, great, good.
You wrote a beautiful piece, I thought, in Unheard recently about this Super League thing that basically rose up hugely and has suddenly gone as quickly. And about the effect this would have. But you were writing about football as being a faith and a cultural, of such cultural importance. Were you surprised that there was such a reaction to that deal when it came up? Were you surprised at the hostility?
No, not really, because I think actually what's happened... It's funny, I was only talking to somebody the other day about this, about how so many of these other working class institutions have died, and that means that football's actually acquired even more importance, because it really is the only one of those things left, actually. And I think a lot of people feel that it's now, if you live in Bolton or Bury or Wolverhampton, the team I support, the football team is really the only local institution left that feels distinctive and of which you can be proud and that binds people in the kind of area together. And so I think a lot of people feel that, if that league had happened, almost certainly the remaining teams, the rest of the Football League, would have been kind of eviscerated, because the money would have followed the Super League. They wouldn't have got the TV deals would have collapsed, and they would have been in real trouble, as already happened in Bury, actually, where their team went out of business. And I think a lot of people just sort of felt, we will lose something quite precious. And it's not just about the game. It's about an institution that has deep historic roots, that meant something to my parents and to my grandparents and to sort of the people who lived in this place before us. And that if we lose that, then we're left with nothing, because our city centre or our town centres have been hollowed out. Talent and money has all flowed to London, and there are lots of parts of the country people feel abandoned, and they feel sort of undervalued. I think that's a huge part of it. They feel kind of culturally neglected, and actually having that team, if you live in, I despise West Bromwich Albion, but if you live in West Bromwich, having a Premier League team, or at least a yo-yo club, it's something that you can genuinely be proud of. It's the one thing for which your area is known, and that gives it kind of meaning to a lot of people. And I think that's actually, it is a bit of a faith, in the sense it's a weekly ritual. and it's replaced the rituals of old. And without it, I think people would feel adrift, kind of rudderless and abandoned.
Yes, I mean, I think that you put it very nicely in this article. I'm going to quote you back at yourself here, but yes, you said saying that football clubs are just businesses is like saying the medieval church was just a landowner. But the thing is in a way, isn't that sort of the people who just see it as a business? They would be, if you like, the free marketeers, would they not? They would be the people who see the everything is a balance sheet, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would, exactly. I mean, I don't think there's always this belief that sort of conservative-minded people do see life purely as a balance sheet. I mean, this is the sort of accusation that you often get from sort of left liberalish people. But actually, the people who were most in favour of the Super League were sort of economics writers for the New Yorker, who, kind of quite woke people, who see nothing wrong with clubs being unmoored from their traditional communities. I mean, to them, the traditional communities are the problem, not the sort of solution. So yes, I think there is. The interesting thing is that it took football to do this, nothing else. So our high streets have been kind of hollowed out. Everybody shops at Amazon. In other walks of life, as it were, globalization has prevailed. But football, precisely because of what you said, that it's kind of a religious faith element to it, because it sort of tugs at people's hearts and minds. This was the one thing that millions of people were just determined to draw a line in the sand and say, no, you won't come for our game. And I think it's really interesting that it was football, something that's really ultimately most people know deep down is a kind of trivial thing, but it mattered. Yes, and if people think it matters, it matters. Exactly. And that's what's so interesting about it.
Exactly. In fact, in your book, Who Dares Wins, the latest in your series about British history, wasn't it during this period that football was at its lowest ebb? Around the early 80s. So it sort of came back, didn't it? Was it in the 90s, I guess?
Yes, it was. It was. It's a really interesting story. So in the 1980s, you would, I think, reasonably have assumed that football would probably die, or that it would become a mere hobby, a sort of antiquated hobby in some ways. Because attendances had been falling for 20 years, the stadiums were crumbling, there were disgraces. Obviously, the game's utterly overshadowed by hooligan violence. I mean, every Saturday, you go through the newspapers from the time, every single Saturday, there were reports of real trouble, sort of quite vicious trouble. And of course, when English teams went abroad, they exported the hooliganism, they took it with them. There's an example I give in the book of Mrs. Thatcher goes to a European Council meeting in Italy in 1980, and it's when she's asking for our money back, if you remember, for our budget rebate. And so she's sort of on the warpath, but it's quite early in her first term, so she's finding her way, and she wants to make a good impression on all these European leaders. And she's there at precisely the same time that the England football team are playing in the European Championships in Rome. And she had had a reception at Downing Street to see them off, and she had been photographed on the steps of number 10 and the step outside with Emlyn Hughes and Kevin Keegan kissing her. So they were the sort of senior players. So she had slightly wrapped herself in the England team's flag, and they went, and the hooligans behaved abysmally. The Italian police used tear gas to try and clear the hooligans, which then went onto the pitch. So the players had to come off in tears. And then the game was resumed. It was unbelievably humiliating for English football. And of course, the cameras went to, I think she was in Venice, and she gives an interview in Venice, and you can see that she's humiliated. It's incredibly embarrassing for her to come out of this meeting and have to basically apologise for her fans. And I think at that point, English football, or football generally, was a sort of, it was a disgrace. It was a disgrace on the national kind of flag. And what changed it was obviously new money, globalization, satellite television. Famously, England did quite well at the 1990 World Cup, and Paul Gascoigne cried on TV. And lots of people got behind, sort of middle-class people got behind the game. So it really is a kind of, ugly duckling story. You wouldn't have expected at that point football to have revived.
Yes, it's interesting you say there some middle class people got behind the game. That's how I remember in the 90s. It suddenly became sort of almost part of the middle class, quite self-conscious lad culture. Do you remember that
absolutely.
period?
I remember it well because I'm of that generation. So,
right.
I went up to university in 1993 and I was absolutely of that generation where the lad culture kind of came in, and the sort of slightly affected kind of middle class enthusiasm for football. I mean, Tony Blair famously said, remember watching Jackie Milburn play for Newcastle, despite the fact that Jackie Milburn had retired before he was born. There was this sort of, I mean, that just simply didn't happen in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Politicians didn't pretend to they didn't feel the need to like football because football hadn't been fashionable. And then it absolutely did become fashionable in the 90s. And I think that's obviously once hooliganism had been dealt with. Yeah.
You said you went up to Sheffield. You said Sheffield, I'm sorry. It was
No, I taught at Sheffield later on. I was at Oxford.
You taught at Sheffield. But you started off, did you not, Dominic, as a specialist in American history?
I did.
You are the chronicler of post-war Britain now, but I wonder, this is a fascinating time for American history, is it not? I mean, I would say depressing, but this is. I wonder what your thoughts on this were. It seems to me that America, which has always played a big part in my life, anyway, has sort of actually entirely changed. It's changed in its nature. I mean, do you think that that's the case?
I do think I think all the problems are quite deep-rooted. I mean, they have historic roots. And obviously, the legacy of slavery is a huge part of it. And obviously, things like the gun culture have always been, have been there for as long as America has existed because it's a frontier society. But there's no doubt that since, let's say, the 1980s or the 1990s, something has changed. And I think America has lost its sense of self-confidence. I think it's turned inwards. And then obviously part of that is because of Iraq and so on. But there has been a kind of hyper-polarization of American politics. There's no common ground. There is a sort of tolerance of violence generally and extremism and incredibly strident, aggressive kind of rhetoric and behaviour that you just don't really see on this side of the Atlantic. And the sad thing is actually, Peter, that it's hard to see how it would ever be resolved. Exactly. I mean, I was only talking last week to a BBC correspondent in America who's lived in America for years. And he was saying, in the time that he's been there, all these problems have kind of been there in embryo, but they have so clearly got worse. And the sense of any sort of national solidarity or common ground or self-confidence in the world just seems so out of reach. And I can't remember a time where America, I grew up, as probably you did, America was the future. Yes. America was modern and it was free and it was exciting. And I don't think young people think that anymore. I think they think of America as a basket case, which is incredibly sad.
Yes, I think so. It was sort of there was always, the feeling was, if things got really bad, there's always America, and that has entirely disappeared. I would have thought one thing that's particularly fascinating, I'd love to hear what you think as an historian. There is this move now, which is not that covered here, to entirely change the basis of American history in this 1619 project, which started off, I believe, as a New York Times initiative and is now being taught in schools.
Yes.
Can you explain what that actually is about?
So, yes. So this is something I'm not greatly in favour of, I have to say. So it's a project thought sort of dreamed up at the New York Times, and they've exported in this sort of evangelizing way. And it's basically to recast the whole of American history, to say that we didn't start in 1776. It's not all about the founding fathers and breaking away from Britain. The starting point of American history, they argue, is when the first slaves were brought to America. And they basically try to recast the entirety of American history through it's all a story about slavery and race and racism. And what's so interesting about it is that particularly older sort of professional historians, academic historians, people who, incredibly erudite, respected, historians basically said, well, this is rubbish.
Yeah.
It's too one note. Yes, of course, slavery and race are part of the story, but they're not the whole story. You can't reduce the whole thing just to this sort of simplistic morality story. But they've been drowned out, basically, particularly by younger historians who sort of say, shut up, Grandad. You're part of the problem, not the solution. And this sort of, it's the historical reflection of this kind of woke movement. And it basically, what I dislike about it, and there are parallels in Britain, actually, sadly, is I think it reduces the complexity of history to this sort of good versus evil, black hats versus white hats, villains and victims story where basically everything is about race and racism. And if you want to tell a different story, well, you're not, you have difficulty in finding an audience.
Yes.
And the fact that they're pushing this into schools, I really find that very objectionable. I mean, I think schools should have a lot more, well, they shouldn't be dictated to tell they shouldn't be force-fed a very politically partisan, but also kind of one-note and slightly simplistic view of their own history. And a history they're basically been turned into a colossal exercise in kind of self-flagellation and kind of victimhood. And yes, it is an American story, but it's also increasingly becoming a British one as well. Yeah. It's a sort of, what I dislike about it personally is not, it's not that I think these things shouldn't be discussed. Of course they should. They're part of history. But I hate the premise, which is often, we've been lying. People have been lying to us about history, and this elite conspiracy have been covering up the truth. And now we've found the truth, which is that there are goodies and baddies. I mean, I just think that's an incredibly simplistic and shallow way to think about the complexity of the past.
I actually had conversations last year during the whole statues thing with people very much along those lines, actually. Where they said, oh, well, now we know. I didn't know, said this person. I didn't know that Nelson, was a slave trade. Of course, he's not, nothing like.
Yeah.
But somehow, and so therefore he should come down. Things like that.
Yes.
It's that level, is it not? Of, as they say, a little learning is a dangerous thing, isn't it?
It is exactly that, because almost all the things that are the supposedly great revelatory discoveries, they have been known, actually. They've been known for years, and people have often talked about them. What happened is that people didn't think they were the be-all and end-all. Yeah. So they weren't always centre stage. And as you say, there is a slight element of little learning. So people will often say, you often hear now, I wasn't taught this in schools. It's a disgrace that I wasn't taught this in schools. But I mean, there's lots of things you're not taught in schools. No one's stopping you from going and finding it out. And you're not, and maybe you're not being taught it in schools because kids are only doing 40 minutes of history a week. It's not because it's being deliberately suppressed. The idea that there's only one story that should be told, and it has to be this story of, in Britain's case, of evil imperialists and sort of saintly victims and martyrs. I just think it's actually what I really dislike about it, Peter, quite apart from the politics of it, is that it's stupid. I think it's just a really stupid way to think about the past. Of course, let's say Churchill was this incredibly interesting, rich character, and because he was human, as in he was cut from the same cloth as anybody else, he's flesh and blood as we are, he wasn't perfect. Surprise, surprise. Now I read, we've just discovered that Churchill said some off-colour things, or he made mistakes or whatever, as though this is this great revelation. But of course, by definition, I mean, he was a human being. It doesn't diminish his greatness or diminish his great qualities to say, he wasn't this sort of divine demigod-like figure. And the same with Nelson, and the same with all these kind of heroes of history. Of course they had feet of clay because they're human beings. I don't think it's actually terribly interesting to sort of focus in on the feet of clay to the exclusion of all else. I think what's interesting about them are the things they got right as much as the things they got wrong. And I just worry that so much of our story is being reduced to this very, very sort of, as I said, kind of simplistic, almost kind of, it's sort of ladybird history, but actually that's mean to ladybird history. Ladybird history was often much more nuanced than some of these sort of versions that you get now.
Yes. Well, I grew up on them, so I mean, do you have anything? Do you speak at schools? Do you have anything to do with schools? Do you do? I mean, what? Yeah,
I do. Well, actually, the funny thing is that I do speak at schools, and I think sometimes people get the wrong idea, both about teachers and about students. So actually, a lot of teachers are not completely dedicated, reasonable, interested, open-minded people. The idea that they're all kind of slaves to wokishness is actually not right, and that's true of students too. One of the great tragedies of the way we talk about higher education, for example, is that the only people that generally get quoted or paid attention to are that tiny minority of kind of activists, the people who bother to care about the student union. And of course, the great majority of students are completely normal. So often I've gone to give talks at universities, and sometimes I'll go to, and I think, is this the moment, when I get cancelled? Yeah. Is this the moment when the students sort of obeying mob sort of drives me out into the gutter or something? And it never is, because the majority of students are just like students have always been. They're open-minded, reasonable, tolerant, curious, intelligent people. And there's a small minority, and what's a shame is when you allow that tiny minority to dictate. So, for example, at Liverpool, the University of Liverpool has cancelled Gladstone. Because he, spoke up for his family's interests in the Caribbean, his slavering interests. The fact that Gladstone then went on to become, this great progressive reformer of the Victorian era, I mean, that's completely forgotten. That's not good enough. And actually, the vast majority, I would think, of students and probably of staff at the University of Liverpool would never dream of cancelling Gladstone. But it's so often the very noisy, strident, sort of over-enthusiastic, idealistic minority who get their way because other people have got better things to do than to fight the fight. We've
got this actually this week, most recently with Isaac Newton, who is just, they're lapping around, lapping at the shores of Isaac Newton. The point is though, so I see what you mean about the numbers, and there's a very vociferous minority. It would appear that the punishment for possibly standing up for something is just too great now for people. They don't want to be cast out, and there's a very strong chance if you say, for example, I think we should leave Cecil Rhodes alone or something, then wow, you're going to get it, aren't you?
Yeah, I think you're right. So, for example, on the Rhodes thing, I always said, and said many times in my columns in the Daily Mail, probably boring the readers into a stupor, that Rhodes should not come down. I don't believe any statues should come down, actually. I think if you're on the side of people who are toppling statues, that's a pretty bad place to be. But, of course, it's easy for me to say that because, I'm a Daily Mail columnist. So that's kind of what people expect to some extent. But academics that I know people at Oxford who said to me they didn't think Rhodes should fall, but they would never say so publicly. They were afraid to. And people sometimes think, oh, this is probably exaggerated or this is all sensationalized, and it's not really like this. But to give you an example, Peter, I have a good friend at Cambridge who was told, he's not British, he was told when he was seen reading the Times in the senior common room of his college, and somebody said to him, "Oh God, you're reading a kind of fascist newspaper." That's a big statement, to be reading the sports section in the Times at lunch. And he said, there are people who think that, and there is a kind of if you persist in these views or that sort of thing, then you might not be driven out of the profession, but people will just say, "Oh, he's the conservative one," and you'll be stuck with this kind of label, which means you might not get invited to things, or people say, "Oh," I can remember a case at Oxford about 15 years ago when they were inviting a visiting speaker from America, a professor, to come and speak, and somebody said in the meeting to agree to invite him, they said, "Yeah, I agree, we should invite him, we should invite him. But he's actually a bit of a centrist, so I think we should have someone from the left for balance. And you know, that's obviously how it works. And so what you end up with is the culture in institutions. I mean, universities are part of it, but also arts institutions and so on. Frankly, I mean, I've said it in my column, you know, it can be a bit of a culture of appeasement. You know, people outside shout and scream, and they can be, you're right, I mean, they're a small minority, but they can be very influential. They shout and scream, and the university or the institution are like, oh my God, we can't allow a Twitter storm, so we'll give in to them. And time and again, you see people giving in, and I just think they should have more of a flipping backbone. Yes. And sometimes they should say to, you know, students or to activists, okay, you've had your say, we don't agree with you. You know, the statue's going to stay up. We're still going to teach X, Y, and Z, or whatever it might be. Yeah. You know, to just show a bit of spirit, rather than sort of constantly abasing yourself before this sort of self-appointed little activist group.
Who have a very kind of religious zeal, actually, don't they? A very With your books, I mean, I don't know whether you say you're a Daily Mail columnist, whether you're perceived as a conservative historian or what. But I mean, is there? I mean, some of the conversations that I've had with people on this program, they talk endlessly about the particular problem with publishing, i.e., that publishing now is very, very left wing, and I just wondered whether, you know, you don't have problems getting your books published. Presumably that's because they sell. Is that the case?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose they sell, but also the books, my history books, aren't dictated by a political agenda. I wouldn't say. No. So people sometimes, you're right. People sometimes say, "Oh, he writes for the Daily Mail, therefore his books must be a sort of conservative tirade." But I mean, as you know, if they're actually probably much more boring than that.
They don't particularly. They are actually very sort of matter of fact in the best sense, it seems to me. But the one thing that I have picked up with them, which I respond to very much, is that you tend to shed new light where things have been portrayed as, for example, the 60s, hugely countercultural, this happening, that happened. You fill in the background, say, well, actually, you know, life was going on very much the same. I remember there was one particular thing that stuck out in my mind in White Heat, which was that the 60s, you know, flower power, counter-revolution, the biggest selling album was the soundtrack to The Sound of Music, I believe. Yeah,
that's right.
So you know, it goes against this kind of idea. You know.
Yes, and I think there's a danger. So what you get with historians, probably by and large, tend to be sort of left liberal people, and so they look at history and they look for people like themselves. I mean, we all do that to some extent. And from the start, I thought, you know, it's much more interesting to look at actually as much as possible at the great majority. You know, what were the most popular things? What were people doing? Were they going to orgies and all that sort of, you know, happenings and sit-ins, or were they mowing the lawn? And often the answer is they're mowing the lawn. And one thing I've tried to do throughout that entire series is to sort of, you know, obviously there's lots about the great and the good, and there's also lots about the sort of more sort of eye-catching extremes, but always, you know, what are people doing in Northampton? Yeah. What are people doing in Worcester? You know, what's life actually like for ordinary people? You know, and actually that's probably one reason why publishers do like them, is because they obviously strike a chord among people who weren't necessarily, you know, the great and the good. They weren't on Carnaby Street in 1966, or they weren't, you know, doing sort of sit-ins in the 70s, or going on anti-Thatcher demonstrations in the 80s, or at Greenham Common. I mean, those things are all in the books. And, you know, I try to sort of treat them properly. But to me, there's as much sort of drama and interest often in the life of somebody who's bought their first council house in 1982, or, you know, a young family starting out on the sort of on the road together through kind of life and work in the 70s or something, going on their first foreign holiday, the first car, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's sort of finding, you know, excitement and interest. Maybe excitement's quite a strong word, but interest in the mundane details of life in an age that actually now seems in some ways like sort of ancient history.
I was actually going to make that very point. It's astonishing with Who Dares Wins, for example, which is 1979 to 1982. When I was, just coming out of university, it does feel like a totally different world, and indeed, I think it was a different world actually. But one thing that is in here too, and I find fascinating, is during this short period of 3 years, there was, particularly after 1980, this kind of very odd sort of counter revolution in culture. We can put them all together. Chariots of Fire, the Royal Wedding, the Falklands, the New Romantics. It was like this sudden, and also a lot of Elgar around and Vaughan Williams and things like that. It's extraordinary that you pick all of that up, because you would have been in your teenage years then?
No, not yet. I'm a pygmy in years. I was not even 10. I was about 8 or 9. Yeah.
Why did you?
So no. Go ahead. Sorry.
Why did you decide to write this sort of history then?
I think I was fascinated with the day before yesterday, the sort of period that my parents had grown up in, and I suppose I started writing them as well at the moment when that was dead, when that period was dead. So I started writing them at the point when the internet had arrived, when Britain was much more globalised, when the days of kind of orange juice as a starter belonged to history, and the sort of British Leyland era, if you like. And I just sort of thought, I found it fascinating because it was, I could just remember it, but not quite. And I just thought, nobody else is doing this. And I just think, I just thought it was great. I just thought it was a great period. And I also thought the trick would be to weave together, Margaret Thatcher and Harold Wilson with Paul McCartney and David Bowie and, the football and TV and all that sort of stuff. So, it is a vanished world, Peter. I think you're right. I think there's lots of things in it, the holidays, what people ate, the clothes, and all that sort of thing.
What they watched on
TV. But you're right as well, actually. At that point you make about there being a cultural shift in the early 80s is absolutely right. I think what actually happened was the 70s have been so grim that there was just a yearning for escapism. And then, of course, people forget that, after 1979, at first, things got so much worse with the massive unemployment and the rioting in the streets and so on, and the government seemed to have completely lost control of the economy. And all of that sort of Brideshead Revisited, people in cricket jumpers kind of
Sloane
ethos.
Rangers,
Yeah, Sloane Rangers, exactly. I think a lot of that comes from this sort of desire. People had the desire for escapism and a desire for glamour and theatricality and also patriotism, actually. I think that's one of the biggest things that this period bequeathed was it revived this sort of patriotic populism, if you like. It's what Mrs. Thatcher capitalised on in the Falklands. That basically, if you were 20 in 1980, all your life you just heard about the flag coming down in one way or another. So the end of the British Empire, the loss of all these colonies, but also just devaluation of the currency, 3-day week, bailout from the IMF, winter of discontent, this sort of sense of Britain being a bit of a failed state. And there was this yearning, and that's why when the Falklands War happened, even lots of die-hard Labour voters who hated Margaret Thatcher said, well, I respect her for getting the task force to the South Atlantic, getting the islands back. She said there's a quote at the end of the book from a Birmingham shop steward, and he says, I've never thought of voting Conservative before, but I am thinking about it now because of Maggie, because she said what she was going to do and she did it. And I think basically the previous 20 years, there's been an awful lot of saying what we were going to do and not doing it. And I think that's that's probably what she'll be, apart from being the first woman Prime Minister, is that sort of patriotic side to her that I think it explains her place in our national imagination.
I think so. The 10 years, the 79 to 89, 90, there was a transformation. You felt, for example, if you were Conservative, like I was at the time, you felt that you were on the winning side. That was it. But also there was a sort of sense that we weren't going to have managed decline anymore. That was the big thing. Dominic, when is the next one coming out, and what period will it cover? Are you allowed to tell us that?
I am, yeah. No, the next one will be not for a few years because of something that I'll just tell you in a sec. And the next one will be really, the hinge of the next one will be the miners' strike.
Right.
So it'll be going into the sort of middle of the 80s. So you've obviously got the Big Bang coming in the city and so on. But the miners' strike is the sort of big confrontation that gives it, its flavour. And the reason it's going to be a few years is because I've just spent the last year starting a new series of history books for children.
Oh, right.
Called Adventures in Time, and they're sort of non-fiction narrative history, but for sort of 9, 10, 11-year-olds, because my son is 9 and I was trying to find something for him. He was doing evacuees at school as his topic, and he said he wanted to read a book about the Second World War, and I couldn't quite find the right thing. And I said to my editors at Penguin, it's weird how no one's done this, how Max Hastings hasn't done a kind of kids version.
Yes.
And why don't I do it? So I have started doing it.
I grew up at school on R.J. Unstead. Do you remember him?
Everybody always says they like R.J. Unstead. And they are like, I loved R.J. Unstead,
right,
exactly.
Right. Well, so there's one on the Second World War. Are these books out now? Sorry, Dominic.
They're coming out. The first couple are coming out in the summer, and then there's 2 more coming out in the autumn, and then hopefully some more in a year or 2. So they're called Adventures in Time, and the first 2 are perhaps not unpredictably the Second World War and the 6 Wives of Henry VIII.
Right.
And then in the autumn there's the First World War and Alexander the Great, and then some more to follow thereafter.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, that's great to hear. It's wonderful. And then in the fullness of time there'll be the miners' strike. And then you've got your whole Blair period, haven't you? Can I just ask, because people often ask these sort of things when they put comments down on how, these are huge volumes. I mean, how long does it take you to write one of these?
Well, I'm doing other things, so it slightly depends on.
Yes.
It's very hard to answer because I'm always sort of juggling. But it takes a few years. It probably takes 4 years, maybe. I guess there's a lot of. I do all the research first. Yeah. And then I write it up. I mean, doing the research has become both easier and harder because of the internet. Yeah. So in that book, Who Dares Wins, all the Thatcher stuff, so all her papers are online. They've been digitised by the Thatcher Foundation. It's an amazing website, sort of Margaret Thatcher Foundation website. And that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you can look up everything straight and get it straight away. But it's a curse because all the stuff is there, so there's almost no excuse not to go through it all. Yeah. So I probably spent about 18 months just sort of scrolling through endless PDFs of sort of Margaret Thatcher's paperwork. And I couldn't quite tell when my life ended and hers began, as it were. So probably like how Charles Moore feels. So, yeah.
Well, look, Dominic, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic, really has. I mean, I can't recommend these books enough. They don't need my recommendation because many people, the critics praise them to the skies. But anyway, the latest one, Who Dares Wins, in paperback. Excellent stuff. And we will look out as well for the Adventures in Time, which should, I think is, you are performing a public service by doing that, actually, because particularly for kids now. Dominic, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
It's lovely. Thank you so much. That's it for So What You're Saying Is This Week, and we shall see you next time. But in the meantime, please do subscribe, will you? Thanks so much. Bye-bye.